In 2013, an artist by the name of Omori posted the comic Omori's Story to her blog. In the comic, a boy named Omori sits in a black and white void before entering a door to a colorful world of friendship and fantasy. While chasing a young woman up a staircase of cats, the world fades away and Omori finds himself back in the dreary white space. He looks down at his notebook filled with art as the invisible camera pulls away to reveal the endless nothing that surrounds the character. Omori's Story is not the nexus point of the 2020 cult classic indie game Omori. That honor goes to a series of Tumblr and blog posts, mostly lost to time. But in some senses, it is the spiritual beginning of Omori as a fleshed out story. We see a lonely boy longing for something, a memory, a fantasy? Hard to exactly say. But what we know for sure is this longing is unfulfilled, and instead the boy sits lonely without. 2,701 days after Omori's Story was published, Omori released and opens with the same idea, now set to words. Welcome to white space. You have been living here as long as you can remember. But now, instead of viewing this hikikomori among a mess of scribbled drawings, the player finds themselves as that boy. What follows is both a gut-wrenching exploration of guilt, trauma, and self-harm, and a sweet and humorous tale of friendship, love, and perseverance. How the player parses this duality is practically the point of the game. I can tell you at the outset of this massive video that Omori is one of the most unique and intriguing games I've ever played. A lot of people seem to agree with me, as the significantly large fandom of the game and its overwhelmingly positive review status on Steam reveal. Yet, while a significant amount of praise has been sent Omori's way, what I find exciting about Omori has not been discussed to the extent of my liking, and even positive reviews tend to miss what I find most interesting about the game. The video you are watching is my attempt to expand the discussion of Omori, take it in a new direction, figure out what's so beautiful about this haunting game. We will explore some of the most interesting aspects of Omori, and on the other side, I hope you see what I see. Omori is a deeply special game worthy of a feature-length film's worth of discussion. You can treat each of the 5 segments of this video, Earthbound and Down, Boy Between Worlds, Let's Get Emotional, The Truth, and Every Kel Meme is Error, as a distinct essay unto itself, but they will build off each other to an exciting conclusion, so make sure to watch all the way through. Despite the runtime of this video, I sincerely do not want to waste your time, so let's get to our spoiler warning and get this show on the road. Spoiler alert! There is an ultra mega late game spoiler for Omori. If you have any plans on playing it, you should avoid that spoiler. I will discuss the big spoiler in part 4 and only part 4. You're free to watch parts 1 through 3 and part 5 and only have light aspects of the game's plot and narrative revealed. Perhaps by the time you get to part 4, you may be convinced to play the game yourself. No matter what you choose, I sincerely hope you enjoy my elaborate review of Omori. On January 7th, the year of our Lord 2022, a Twitter user whose name is redacted for the purposes of this review tweeted, "You know what would make a game fun? A bunch of sad shit." Accompanying these 2 sentences was a meme in 2 pictures. In the first, the famous fictional toy astronaut voiced by Tim Allen. Below his smiling face, the words, 16-bit indie platformer games that's actually an allegory of abuse and/or depression. Sure, there's a typo in there, and technically it's about platformer games, not RPGs, but I've got to know where this is leading. What insight might this image convey? We get our answer in the second image, shelves filled with Toy Story's Buzz Lightyear, implying that there is nothing unique about the game described. This tweet received, as of the time of this writing, 8,146 likes 921 retweets and 1,224 quote retweets, which is a lot for something so inane. Despite the attention, this image nor the sentiment behind it is particularly new. 2 days prior, a meme with the title, "Earthbound invented having humor with a few serious moments," appeared on our gaming circle jerk and received 11.1k upvotes. 6 months earlier, a user from iFunny, where ideas are often quite original and certainly not reposts from somewhere else, posted a gif of the same Buzz Lightyear scene from Toy Story with the text, "I'm an indie developer making a game inspired by Earthbound and its themes of depression." This image received 1.6k smiley faces. A month before that, a YouTuber posted this video in which infinite carbon copy Sailor Moon toys, meant to symbolize the Earthbound-inspired indie RPG, are made and shipped, each one identical to the last. The top comment on that video, given the elusive heart by the video's creator that I give to 9/10 of the comments on my videos, seriously go check the comments, simply says,
"It's like they're being AI generated at this point. These Earthbound-inspired RPGs about depression need to fucking stop."
Quite a bit of vitriol for the perceived descendants of an unpopular 30-year-old game. What's wrong with Earthbound? What's wrong with being quirky or, God forbid, inspired? Evidently, quite a lot. Implicitly caught in the crossfire of this backlash is Omori, perhaps the game most representative of the trend these meme disparagers hate. In fact, I can't recall seeing these memes before Omori's release and subsequent popularity, so it's fair to say these memes may be directed not at a pseudo-genre as a whole, but squarely at the forehead of Omori, and specifically because it has a rabid fan base. In this section, we're going to discuss Earthbound and Yumi Niki's influence on Omori, because it helps us understand the game better. But I'd like to start by exorcising all this negative energy from the room because it's given me the heebie-jeebies. It's important to understand these haters aren't sick of playing these games, they're sick of hearing about them. So let's set aside whether or not they have played Earthbound or the games they are criticizing, because that matters less than what they think these games represent. Moreover, anyone who has played them probably understands they aren't for everyone and hopefully could respect an honest critique. These memes aren't honest critiques though, are they? From my understanding, the haters attribute the following qualities to the quirky Earthbound-inspired RPG: humor, simple graphics, child protagonists, psychological themes, and a desire to be original. Lots of video games have a sense of humor. Simple graphics sure are easier to make than complicated ones, and child protagonists are pretty common too. I didn't see anyone complaining about Pokemon's insistence on sending kids out to do cockfighting, so none of these things stand out as particularly noteworthy. As the memes indicate, what really grinds their gears are those last two qualities: games with darker themes hidden behind a sunny exterior, and games that they think they are special. You can't separate these two concepts because it's precisely the gentle combination of gloomy disposition and lighthearted jokes that strikes these would-be critics as yielding the originality they desire to deride. From a games industry standpoint, the central visual argument of these memes, the existence of an endless amount of quirky Earthbound-inspired RPGs, is pretty easy to disprove. Off the top of my head, I can only name a handful released since Undertale, the most popular game in this genre, dropped in 2015. Those games are Undertale, One Shot, Omori, Ikenfell, and Deltarune. That's about it. Without Undertale, there are no memes, so it makes sense to set that as our starting point, though other games within the genre, like YIIK and Lucy, predate it. Omori itself began development before Undertale dropped too. I'm sure more games are out there, but if I, someone who has the gall to like this kind of game, have only heard of about a half dozen, less than the amount of Call of Duty games released in the same period, then in the allegorical toy store housing metaphorical game genres, there certainly isn't an entire aisle dedicated to hundreds of Earthbound clones. Perhaps the problem isn't that only a few of these games exist, perhaps it's the adjective quirky, which truly assaults these high-minded individuals' sensibilities. Quirky can mean original, but I don't believe it does in this context. Quirky for games of this genre, if they even do use it to describe themselves, relays a sense of humor, which at times borders on the self-reflexive and absurd. Referring back to Earthbound, the game has bad puns, breaks the fourth wall, and tends to subvert the player's expectations. A classic example of this is when a powerful psionic bee descends from the heavens, or 10 years from the future, to give Ness his quest to save the world, and a few moments later is swatted out of the air and killed by a middle-aged mother of two. That said, the game isn't just a self-referential postmodern piece of art, it's mostly an earnest story where the humor plays up the fact that it's a fictional place. Quirky regarding Earthbound-inspired RPGs does not describe a desire to be original, despite the definition of the word, but the tone the games employ. Quite relevant to their creators' self-conception, especially considering this tone isn't particularly popular. Thus, it's not convincing when you craft a scarecrow out of someone you've never met's intentions and attack those intentions as if you know their motivation just because they're making an RPG game with a sense of humor. Is it? And what's so bad about wanting to be original? Do you think even the designers of the 20th Call of Duty game are sitting around striving to make an unoriginal game? Insulting an artist because they want to be original seems like the kind of attack that could be levied at anyone who ever dares to create anything. Heck, I'm sure you could type in the comments right now and tell me how unoriginal I am. Haven't I heard of Noah Caldwell-Gervais, Tim Rogers, or Jacob Geller? At least they have the courage to put their name on their channel rather than a reference to a minor mistranslation from a 35-year-old Zelda game or a relatively obscure book by Nathan Altice. I'm not the only person to find humor in the attempts of cynics to minimize these games, but what I find so irritating about their animosity is how much it's rooted in contempt for other people having an authentic experience with a video game. You'd think such a level of resentment might come from those who hate video games in general and can't believe that someone would have an earnest interaction with any video game, a child's toy. But these are game likers. We can tell because they've evidently been exposed to what feels like to them an endless stream of Earthbound-inspired RPGs. I don't think too many non-gamers have even heard of Undertale, let alone whatever kickstarted RPG has their panties in a bundle. Instead, like seething Squidward watching through drawn shades, they can't fathom that someone else would be having so much fun. Perhaps I will live long enough to become a Squidward to some burgeoning genre of games I detest. But for now, why not come outside and enjoy Omori with me? So, enough about why people seem to hate quirky Earthbound-inspired RPGs. Let's talk about why people like them. I suppose we've got to understand why people like Earthbound if we want to understand the appeal of its supposed progeny. Though, a quick note, this video is about Omori, not Earthbound. Maybe someday I'll make an elaborate review of Earthbound, or maybe I won't. But don't expect my discussion of the game in this video to be exhaustive. I'm mostly interested in those aspects of Earthbound we find in Omori. Omori, for its part, wears Earthbound's influence on its sleeve. Simply Googling Omori gameplay screenshot and comparing it to Earthbound gameplay screenshot should produce an understanding that these games are in the same wheelhouse. Of course, games that look similar are not necessarily similar, but why do so many games, an endless stream you might say, bother evoking the spirit of Earthbound at all? Earthbound, despite being a commercial flop in the West, managed to attract a wide number of groupies, people who swear that it's one of the best games they've ever played. Occasionally, it is even included on lists purporting to announce the greatest video games of all time. While some might cry foul that it's only those elites, video games damned cognoscenti. Seriously, why is this, of all words, repeated twice on Earthbound's Wikipedia page? Jamming Earthbound down our throats, it's hard to ignore the game's massive cult following. There's something about Earthbound that people find enticing and memorable. But what? Perhaps most importantly, Earthbound stands apart. While the cries of unoriginality plague the discussion of Omori and games of its ilk 25 years later, it's tricky to find any games like Earthbound from its own period. On the face of it, before a single minute of the game is played, Earthbound stands out. It's an idiosyncratic JRPG set in a pastiche of modern America about a boy and his friends saving the world from aliens from the future. To even get something resembling the game from the year of its release, we'd have to jam together Final Fantasy VI's JRPG elements, XCOM UFO Defense's aliens, and Beavis and Butthead the video game's humor and setting. And even then, you wouldn't hit on what precisely makes Earthbound feel fresh. When we dig deeper, it becomes even easier to appreciate Earthbound's uniqueness. Earthbound is a game which takes the ordinary and makes it extraordinary. A game where piles of puke and cranky ladies are an obstacle. Where you call your dad to save the game and he tells you not to work too hard. Where you heal yourself not with potions or spells, but hamburgers and pizza. Where yo-yos and frying pans are lethal weapons. Where you tame animals rather than kill them. And hit annoying old men with a baseball bat in order to make them go back to normal. Simply put, Earthbound breathes a character all its own. As such, it surprises the player, and media which earnestly surprises us tends to leave a lasting impression. I'm not trying to demean incremental improvements because they are rad, but they don't usually inspire you to talk about it with a friend. But if something truly astonishes you, you're going to want to go and share it with someone else. Maybe you'll even desire to see the look on their face when they reach some joke or moment that wowed you. While there can be some awkwardness when you share something with someone else and they end up not liking it, we are most apt to go out of our way to share something with an acquaintance if it has that amusing quality. And Earthbound has this kind of amusement in spades. Its legend, at least in the West, spread from word of mouth rather than initial popularity. Sharing a game you love with someone is an act of love. It's fitting that Earthbound, an earnest and surprising act of love itself, has mostly found a home in the hearts of fans because it was personally shared with them. Earthbound's amusement is primarily backed up by its wonderful sense of humor. The game's comedy is distinctly related to the fact that it's a game. Its inside jokes and weird characters wouldn't fit anywhere other than a JRPG. The game relishes in little jokes that don't need to add up to anything more significant than their inclusion, like the Stoic Club, where patrons eat magic cake, stare at a rock, and muse about philosophy, spirituality, and the inevitable collapse of capitalism. Or its plethora of musical references from Yellow Submarines or the Japanese games area named Grateful Dead Valley. These constant references remind me of one of my favorite novels, released 2 years after Earthbound, Infinite Jest. Like Earthbound compared to most games, few books have made me laugh out loud as much as Infinite Jest. But whereas a book with such a magnitude of stories, asides, and references is fundamentally bogged down because the reader experiences them linearly, well, mostly linearly in the case of Infinite Jest, considering that half the book is footnotes, some of which have their own footnotes, In Earthbound, the player is free to experience the humor at their own pace, giving these asides and references space to breathe and not entangle the momentum of the game more than the player allows it. A video like this also does not have such leeway, which is why we can tell in how the obnoxious 101 word sentence I just spoke before this felt overlong and meandering. Earthbound understands a video game's relative freedom in this regard and uses it to build up a wonderful and humorous experience. That experience is not easily emulated, but it's worth attempting to because it's part of what makes games unique. Part of Earthbound's appeal 25 years after its release emerges from the same cultural urges that led to the popularity of vaporwave, city pop, or old school Simpsons episodes. It reminds me of the resurgence of a similarly weird media property from the early 90s, Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks is a strange piece of television, and most people who admire it today probably did not see it when it aired, but found it through its cult following years later. Likewise, most people getting into Earthbound today have no memories from the year 1995, but they have a sense of warped secondhand nostalgia for that time period. I am no different. I asked for and received, thank God, a Super Nintendo Entertainment System, not in the early 90s, because I was a baby then, but only a year before the Nintendo Wii came out. I only asked for it because I had secondhand nostalgia from all the gaming journalists who pined for great games on the system like Earthbound, Final Fantasy VI, and Donkey Kong Country, though Donkey Kong Land was the game I received with my Game Boy Pocket, so maybe I had some nostalgia for that game. As an aside, thanks Grandma and Grandpa for getting me Donkey Kong Land. You made a great choice. Anyway, Earthbound's tongue-in-cheek representation of Eagle Land, a Japanese version of America circa the early 90s, harkens to a culture and vision of childhood that never existed. I can say this because I am canonically only a few years younger than Ness, and I grew up in my state's version of On It. Despite its lack of a real-world corollary, Earthbound's version of the past is incredibly compelling. It holds in one hand an unabashed and earnest innocence, and the other a self-reflexive desire to critique the world around it. How it manages this balancing act, I don't know, but the exact same spirit possesses popular games like Undertale, and more importantly for our study today, Omori, all of which invite the player to enmesh themselves in secondhand nostalgia for a magical past, but within each of their visions, just like the visage of capitalism haunts Vaporwave, a darker presence resides beneath these games, and that darkness grounds them, gives them weight, keeps them interesting. That juxtaposition and inherent contradiction is a large part of why Earthbound remains relevant so many years after its release. Finally, Earthbound is a home run swing that missed. The fact that it failed to land meaningfully in the West upon release gives it an underdog feeling, like it's a game that's not supposed to win. We love to root for the underdog, especially when it's a game as sincere as Earthbound. Earthbound wears its heart on its sleeve, and thus its appeal extends beyond its jokes or gameplay. It's a game you want to like, a game you want to fall in love with. This feeling is often pursued by indie games and their marketing strategies not out of a cynical desire to get sales, but because the powerful emotion that gripped and motivated their developers when they played Earthbound for the first time. While the game may not be for everyone, many who tried it probably did so specifically because they wanted to be someone who had played Earthbound, laughed at its silly jokes, experienced its absurd humor, been moved by its exciting conclusion. Earthbound may be love it or hate it, but I reckon most who hate it can only meaningfully do so after they tried to love it. A heart spurned is more deadly than an indifferent one, I suppose. While Earthbound's fingerprints are all over Omori, from the game's humor to battle system to squad of 4 protagonists, a bizarre RPG maker game from the mid-2000s is just as much to blame for 2020's most popular depression simulator. Of course, I'm talking about Yume Nikki. Or Yumi Nikki, I don't know how to pronounce it. If Earthbound is Twin Peaks, Yumi Nikki is Mulholland Drive, a surreal dreamscape of a game where goals and gameplay are replaced by vivid images and unsettling moments. Yumi Nikki, whose name translates to Dream Diary, centers around a young woman named Marotsuki with the hikikomori condition, meaning she exists in self-imposed isolation, withdrawn from other people. Marotsuki refuses to leave her apartment, and thus the only real option for the player controlling her is to go to sleep. While her exterior life may be exceedingly mundane, her interior life is nothing of the sort. In her dream world, Marotsuki can enter a variety of doors, all leading to unique and befuddling places. They don't make sense, but then again, they don't have to, because it's all a dream, after all. Yumi Nikki's allure and cult-like following primarily comes from 2 places. The first is how naturally it seems to capture the essence of dreams. The game's doors and scant puzzles, if we can even call them that, make little sense, and the game jumps between moments and visions with haphazard delight. While I would struggle to describe the game's aesthetic as appealing, there is a beauty in the game's realistic depiction of the feeling of a dream. A tired energy exudes off the game. Every action the player takes is both effortless and exhausting. Just like the mind is a complicated iceberg with an expansive mass beneath the surface, Yumi Nikki is a deep game. You can spend hours walking around its strange hallways and rooms and not experience all of it. The game abounds in secrets upon secrets. Playing all of Yumi Nikki can feel like an insurmountable task, like dreaming all the dreams. This all adds up to, while I wouldn't say a fun experience, an incredibly memorable one. Like Earthbound, Yumi Nikki is a unique experience unto itself, something you have to play to even start wrapping your head around. Something that will keep you thinking long after you've closed the software. All that pondering leads to a second reason Yumi Nikki has a cult following: interpretation. Normally, listening to someone detail their dreams is one of the most boring ways to have a conversation, but for its fans, Yumi Nikki is a single collective dream for an entire community. One which spends no energy explaining itself, and thus many have spent hours attempting to unravel its mysteries. Was Marotsuki in a car crash? Why does she have a knife? Is the game's creator a hikikomori like the main character? The point is not to answer these questions definitively, but to let them simmer, to contemplate them and use the game as a kind of sacred text with which to do interpretive work. Yumi Nikki has so much substance that has people coming back for 15 years, with a small active community continuing to keep the spirit of the game alive, all because, not in spite of, its confusing, foggy, and obfuscated world. Just like Earthbound's humor works because it's a game, Yumi Nikki's surrealism works because it's a game. Even while dreaming, we still make decisions, have thoughts, speak words, even though everything in our dream exists only in our imagination. While watching a movie like Mulholland Drive can feel like a dream in some aspects, a game like Yumi Nikki, where the player has to actively explore the dreamscape, much more accurately and deeply connects them to their own subconscious, their own surreal thoughts. Yumi Nikki only works because it's a game, because the player chooses which doors to enter and what to do within them. Its surreal imagery takes on loads more additional meaning because its order and timing is dependent on the input of a user, and that user is bound to assign meaning to their choices within the virtual space. Just as Omori's structure is built out of Earthbound, its heart and soul is built off what Yumi Nikki does so well, from a vague dream world to the Hikikomori central character. All three games have something deeper in common. They could each be classified as outsider art, at least as far as video games are concerned. The term outsider art comes from Roger Cardinal's book Raw Creation, Outsider Art and Beyond, and was originally a translation of the French term art brut, approximately meaning raw art. Jean Dubuffet, an artist himself, is often credited with defining and popularizing art brut, which he defined as a work created in solitude, away from the worries of competition, acclaim, and social promotion. In essence, art without the art world, or more broadly, artistic culture, interfering. Much of his early emphasis was on art by psychotic individuals, often imprisoned, who were completely separate from society as a whole, not just the high society that spawns fine art. Dubuffet, I can't pronounce French words, and Cardinal, and those who follow in their tradition, primarily focus on painters and sculptors, though a whole world of outsider music exists as well. In the decades since Cardinal's book, the phrase outsider art, initially a proxy for a specific kind of artistic process, took on a life of its own separate from its art brut connotations. Cardinal himself addressed this in 2009, writing,
"Outsider art is an art of unexpected and often bewildering distinctiveness, and its outstanding exemplars tend to conjure up imagined private worlds, completely satisfying their creator, yet so remote from our normal experiences as to appear alien and rebarbative."
While I am quite fond of this definition, outsider art remains a tricky and delicate term. There is a lot of splitting hairs as to what it means for a work to truly fall into the category. Just because something is weird does not mean it is outsider art. For instance, anything described as avant-garde may be bewildering to most, but it's still made in the context of an artistic culture. Outsider art should ideally refer to the creator of the work, someone outside the standard culture of a medium, and the substance of the work. As Cardinal puts it,
highly idiosyncratic and secretive, and reflects the individual creator's attempt to construct a coherent, albeit strange, private world.
Traditional art is a fertile proving ground for the outsider artist because most projects are the work of a singular artist. Video games struggle to fit within this genre as they require an entire team of individuals working on them, and thus struggle more to fit within the scope of outsider art. Indie games, for instance, are not by definition outsider art. They are simply games made without much in the way of an established studio, developer, or publisher. The content of a classic indie game like Super Meat Boy, Fez, or Braid does not fall within Cardinal's description of idiosyncratic and secretive, or completely remote from our normal experiences, because they mostly draw from and communicate the lineage and history of 2D platformers. These are games made within the milieu of gaming culture on the whole, from people who consider themselves game designers first and foremost. This isn't to say no indie games are outsider art, but rather the denotation of indie does not mean outsider as the term employed in the world of physical arts. On our scale of outsider art, where on the far left-hand side we might have something resembling Dubuffet's art brut like a painting by Adolf Wolfi, and on the far right-hand side we might have a Picasso painting, we can attempt to plot Omori and the two games that most clearly influenced it. Let's first consider Yumi Nikki. Yumi Nikki was not formally released anywhere until 14 years after its release. Instead, it was spread around 2chan, Japan's version of 4chan, where it rose in popularity because of its uniqueness. We know incredibly little about its creator, Kikiyama, who has given few interviews and remains quite secretive. We might be able to read into their life by playing Yumi Nikki, but in terms of Being created or distributed through traditional channels of gaming culture, Yume Nikki stands alone. Its content, essentially a dreamscape walking simulator, predates Dear Esther by nearly 4 years and fits well within Cardinal's description of a coherent, albeit strange, private world. Every piece of evidence we have regarding Yume Nikki resembles the history of Art Brut, from its abstract and rebarbative style to its distribution to its creator's anonymity. So if any game is outsider art, I think that game would be Yume Nikki. I'll be upfront here. Neither Omori nor Earthbound come close to Yume Nikki in regards to being Art Brut, but within the relative context of video games, both display some remarkable qualities that separate them from mainstream game culture. And if we view outsider art as a spectrum rather than a binary, then we can see that they approach the curve of that spectrum. Earthbound, published by Nintendo, and even having much of its programming done by future Nintendo president Satoru Iwata, is an odd contender for outsider art. And while the 10th best-selling Japanese game of 1994 doesn't come close at all to Art Brut, it is worth talking about the game's brainchild, Shigesato Itoi. Shigesato Itoi is a bit of a renaissance man. He wrote copy for advertising in the 80s, co-wrote a collection of short stories with Japanese literary legend Haruki Murakami, came up with the name for the Game Boy, voiced the dad in My Neighbor Totoro, and directed Mother 1, 2, and 3, the second of which we know in the West as Earthbound. Since the 90s, he has mostly ran a daily blog/news site. He's probably one of the most uniquely interesting people in the world. As a game designer for a big-budget game in 1994, Shigesato Itoi is about as close to an outsider in the games industry as we can get, and importantly, it shows in the design of Earthbound. The aspects of Earthbound we've described as unique come from Itoi's insistence that the team think outside the box and find new ways for games to display moments and make players feel emotions. So, while Earthbound is a mainstream Nintendo game through and through, as far as Nintendo games go, it's the closest any have come to outsider art. Finally, we come to Omori. Amokat, the game's creator, is certainly an outsider. Nominally a graphical artist, she initially envisioned Omori as a graphic novel before landing on making it a video game. She is functionally an outsider to the gaming industry, and her ability to make the game she wanted was primarily because of the resources enabled from a Kickstarter and tools like RPG Maker, which allow those with little in the way of programming skills to still make games. Note, Yume Nikki was also made in RPG Maker. While Omori is templated off Earthbound and Yume Nikki, and this exists within a particular cultural milieu, one that also belongs to games like Undertale and Lisa, when you're playing, it feels like it lives in its own space. Like if someone had gone to an art museum and saw Da Vinci, Picasso, or Rothko, and went home inspired to make something without the same juice that made those artists sensations. So, on our spectrum, rather than a binary of is it outsider art or not, Omori lands somewhere towards Art Brut, but not fully conforming to Cardinal's definition. But why are we bothering to graft the theory and idea of outsider art onto Omori in the first place? Other than it being a particularly interesting part of art history and theory, 2 reasons. First, it helps us understand Omori's strange appeal to certain people who have formed a robust and creative culture around the game. Just as Cardinal insists that outsider art earns its name because it offers its audience a thrilling visual experience, Omori and the games it chooses to take as inspiration are all thrilling visual and oral affairs. The attraction to them is specifically because they exist outside of conventional ways of making games. Between conventional games and Omori, there is a distance, a barrier. And it is from that distance Omori derives its radical, for a game at least, artistic flair. Second, If the central derision towards Omori by some in gaming culture is its lack of originality, an aisle of identical Buzz Lightyears waiting to be played, each the same as the other, classifying aspects of it as outsider art not only helps shield against such accusations, but helps explain why they are flawed. Upon playing Omori, we can tell it is far more like Yume Nikki in tone than Earthbound, and in fact, it is because the game so dolefully takes after some aspects of Earthbound that the elements borrowed from Yume Nikki have their potency. While Earthbound packs an emotional punch, it is the juxtaposition of its sunny exterior with the dark interior of Yume Nikki's unsettling surrealism that makes Omori such an emotionally resonant game. That resonance is so powerful specifically because the game exists in an outsider's space, as a game not made by someone who makes games, not bogged down by convention. The surprising and often haphazard way that Omori flips the switch between these two worlds, these two moods, these two spirits that hang over it like the main character of the game's ghost, haunted by the phantom of the past that often feels indiscernible and indescribable, is the core element of its appeal. Compels people to play and discuss, feel, and engage with its indelible themes and remarkable setting. Now that we know where they come from, we're going to spend the next section interrogating the two worlds of Omori. Thanks for checking out my video. You've already completed part 1. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider becoming a patron of the channel. You'll get special Patreon-only videos and writings. You'll get to vote on what those things are. You'll get special access and privileges on our Discord server, and your name will appear in these videos. This is only the start of the I Am Error channel, so what are you waiting for? Also, special thanks to Lily Noah and Maximus, my two favorite goofs or top level patrons. I lied. Omori does not have two worlds. It has 2.5. And that half world is probably the most important of the bunch. But before we can talk about it, we ought to establish the condition of these worlds. The first world the player encounters is Headspace, where Sunny, the main character of the game, lives a pastel dream as Omori, exploring a vast fantasy land in search of his friend, Basil. We will later argue that Omori and Sunny are distinctly different people, but for illustrative purposes understanding these two worlds, it's useful to think of them as the same person. The second world is Faraway Town. While almost as fantastical sounding, Faraway Town is meant to represent the real world. It is where Sunny lives while he is awake. Faraway Town is quaint compared to Sunny's Headspace, but it's where the game's most consequential events happen. In between Headspace and Faraway Town is White Space, and far beneath them all in the deepest reaches of Sunny's mind is its companion, Black Space. We're going to save our discussion of Black Space for part 4 of this video, but the short of it is that Black Space is a dark and surreal dreamscape, exploring Sunny's deepest regrets and fears. The closest Omori gets to Yume Nikki. White Space, on the other hand, is the liminal place between Headspace and Faraway Town, a train station of sorts, keeping the two worlds separate from one another. It is fitting then that White Space is where the game begins. White Space, as its name implies, is primarily white. Its infinitude is featureless and sterile. A single white square dots the landscape. Within and near, 6 items of intrigue: a laptop, a notebook, a tissue box, a light bulb, a door, and a cat. The notebook is filled with surreal, childlike drawings. The laptop is filled with log entries, alternatively saying, "Today I spent time in White Space, everything was okay," and "Today I visited my friends, everything was okay." And the cat asks, waiting for something to happen. White Space is safe. Nothing bad happens here, but nothing good happens either. The game's opening epigraph notes that you've been living here as long as you can remember. A sobering and sad thought. After finding a knife, Omori can move through the door and into Headspace. Headspace is similarly sterile, but replaces the monochromatic color scheme with a pastel one. Here, Omori joins 3 friends, Hiro, Aubrey, and Kel, and heads to a full playground, meeting up with his sister Mari and their friend, you guessed it, Basil. As they leave their initial playroom, a snake hands them some allowance, the first of many references to Earthbound, this one being how Nessa's father sends him money through an ATM throughout his journey. The more obvious reference to Earthbound here is our quartet of heroes. While not one-for-one recreations of the original Earthbound cast, the basic composition of 3 boys and a girl is here, and they all follow Omori around in the same way Paula, Jeff, and Pooh do Ness. So if you haven't guessed it yet, Headspace is where we find Earthbound's DNA grafted onto Omori. In Headspace, we encounter fantastical creatures and encounters which border on the absurd, but never outside the realm of possibility established by Earthbound's quirky setting. Our first trip to Headspace is cut short though. Basil shows us his beautiful garden, remarking how the different plants remind him of each of his friends. We follow him to his shoe house, where he shows us his photo album, but he accidentally shows us a picture that's not supposed to be there, which thrusts Sunny out of the make-believe and back into white space. The door to Headspace is gone, and Omori's only path forward is to use the knife on himself, waking him up from his pleasant dream with a sudden rush of pain. The pain pushes Sunny into the depressing world of Faraway Town. If Headspace is an idyllic existence of friendship and love, Faraway Town is the festering remains of those relationships. Sunny lives alone in a house filled with moving boxes. It's the middle of the night, and his dark home is infested with ghosts and horrific visions. He runs from a terrible monster, eats some steak, another homage to Earthbound, and heads back to bed. When Sunny wakes up the next morning after an extended journey through Headspace, Faraway Town's Kel knocks on the door, breaking him out of his self-imposed isolation. Together, they head out to see what has become of the real-world counterparts, only to find that each member of the friend group has been shattered by the death of Mari, Sunny's older sister, which was not a recent occurrence, but one that happened years ago. Thus, the stage of Omori is set. The player and Sunny must make these 2 worlds right. Throughout the game, they will alternate between Headspace and Faraway Town, each night battling psychological representations of vice in a quest to find Basil in the dream world, and each sunrise as a boy saying goodbye to his friends and childhood hometown, trying to piece together what happened to the perfect childhood he had before it tore asunder. The beauty of Omori is the balance between these 2 worlds, what each says about the other, where they connect and detach, and how they come together to tell a story greater than the sum of its parts. In this section, we're going to dive into these 2 worlds, understand what makes them tick, and establish their broader significance for the story Omori seeks to tell. Though, a word about how we understand these 2 worlds in relationship to one another. The most tempting and easy route is to describe Headspace as some kind of fantasy that only exists in Sunny's head, and Faraway Town as the real world of the game. While I might slip up once or twice and refer to them in such a manner, that's not a useful way of looking at Omori for a few reasons. First of all, and I hate to break it to you, but nothing in Omori is the real world. There is a representation of Headspace and a representation of the physical world that Headspace is a part of. Both are still narratives within the same story. Similarly, the player, who the game is actually for, spends more time in Headspace than everywhere else combined, because it is a crucial part of the arching story the game wishes to tell. To devalue it as being less significant than the rest of the game just because it takes place in Sunny's head robs it of its illustrative power to inform the viewer of the values and ideas the game holds dear. Omocat teased players on the original Kickstarter asking, which world is more real? You decide, I guess. But it's a trap to spend too much time focusing on reality. Omori is a deeply emotional game specifically because of what happens in Headspace. So, we're going to treat Headspace as if it is just as important, valid, and real as the events of Faraway Town. It's all the real world of Omori as far as I'm concerned. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about the phenomenon of the two worlds on top of each other, which are in quite a few video games. These aren't alternate universes like in What If, but mirrors which reflect and represent one another. Perhaps the most prominent example of this kind of mirror realm is from an SNES game not named Earthbound, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past's Dark World. The Dark World is not an internal space of fantasy like in Omori, but an external, time-shifted reality of what will happen should Link fail his quest to stop the resurrection of Ganon. As opposed to the game's light world, it is populated by monsters rather than friends, and at its center stands a large and dominating pyramid. As far as the game is concerned, the Dark World is a nightmare, a place of despair created out of Ganon's lust for power. Yet, like all interesting parallel worlds, the Dark World is a place of psychological intrigue. Whoever enters this twisted realm is transformed into a creature that represents their inner self. Many citizens of Hyrule are transformed into greedy pigs like Chihiro's parents in Spirited Away, another mirror world narrative, but one we won't get to in this video. Link, though, is turned into a pink bunny, a symbol of innocence, but also one quite helpless. Link's first task, then, is to find a way to remedy his rabbit form, to ascend beyond his internal self-image and become the hero he's meant to be. Perhaps the most interesting place within these two worlds is Kakariko Village and its Dark World counterpart, Village of Outcasts. Much better name. Before I even begin to describe these two locations, you can tell one of them is messed up. While Kakariko Village is a place of life with chipper fellows and gals with quaint little lives, the Village of Outcasts is the destruction of that charm. It houses thieves and vagabonds and is filled with enemies that hunt Link on sight. Those kind and good people left hide in their homes, fearful of those who lurk in the shadows outside. Village of Outcasts is dystopian, but more importantly, it is a psychological manifestation of Link's fears. It is the inversion of the good of Kakariko Village, replacing its virtues with vices. To some degree, I imagine Village of Outcasts is what Fox News hosts imagine when they hear about trans rights or climate change activists, a conservative understanding of a now under threat of change. Village of Outcasts exists as much in Link's head as it does a genuine place in the narrative of the game. The Village of Outcasts points to the greater meaning of the Dark World on the whole. Like Omori's headspace, it's a place of greater fantasy, detached from the real world of consequences in the game, but gives useful insights into that place. The Dark World is a manifestation of Ganon's wishes and desires, which is why it is corrupted. It's a window into Ganon's soul. Similarly, we understand Link's purity of heart not just from his actions, but because he turns into a hare the moment he enters the Dark World. He does not belong here. In this conception of a world gone awry, specifically because a knight of good heart like him is meant to prevent this kind of tragedy from occurring, or die in the attempt. From the Dark World, we understand the nature of the Light World, with many having a propensity for evil curbed by the good king who keeps them in line, in a way we could not otherwise. The Dark World shows the player the Light World does not exist passively, as if it is always good and always will be, but survives actively due to the actions of the wise, courageous, and strong, and wouldn't you know it, those are the qualities of the Triforce. A Link to the Past is not the most involved or dynamic conception of a parallel world, but I hope by showing this simple and popular example of the genre, you can start to see that the way these kinds of mirror worlds represent each other tells us more than what they can tell us apart. Perhaps the most recognizable parallel world is from The Wizard of Oz. For our purposes, I'm going to focus on the film adaptation of the tale because it's a great example of the trope and typically considered one of the most seen films ever, so hopefully most of you will be familiar with it. Being one of the most seen is quite an accomplishment. This means we will wave away all the allegories for the gold standard in 19th century American politics, since they weren't particularly important by the time the film released. We could also spend all day talking about the tragedies that occurred on the set of the film, and if you're interested in that, there's other YouTubers who have covered the topic, but I am more interested in asking what its representation of a mirror world, one overwhelmingly popular and connects with viewers on a deep level, can tell us about Omori. Like Omori, the Land of Oz appears to be entirely dreamed up by the narrative's main character, Dorothy. Like Omori, Dorothy is joined by 3 companions who represent people from her home life. Like Omori, the Wizard of Oz's dream world is colorful and vibrant, while the real world is drab and difficult. Of course, this isn't to say Omori just rips wholesale from the Wizard of Oz, but rather the themes and motifs of the Wizard of Oz are so common in Tales of Parallel Worlds that nearly everyone borrows from the film. So, let's explore for a moment the meaning of one of the most celebrated pieces of visual art of all time. The Wizard of Oz is, at its most basic level, a story about the struggle between absconding from what you know and staying with the familiar. Dorothy's signature song, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, beyond being an absolutely delightful tune, communicates her desire to be anywhere but here, to fly like a bird away from her home and become her own person. But its melancholic final line, "Why, oh why can't I?" betrays her sad reality. She's got nowhere to go. Of course, this doesn't stop her, and as trouble befalls her and her dog, she sets off to find some other land. While brought on by the emergency of saving her dog, Dorothy's unwillingness to imagine any other way out of her predicament and jumping right on the leave town for good bandwagon shows her predisposition for getting away from Kansas. Dorothy does not get far, as a storm and a vision of her crying aunt pushes her to get home to her family. Arriving home, a tornado sends her truly over the rainbow in more ways than one. She leaves the one-note world of sepia tone and enters the colorful land of Oz. Dorothy gets what she wants to leave home, but not what she needs, satisfaction with her home and family life. Her journey to see the Wizard of Oz is a Bildungsroman, or coming-of-age story, where she learns this lesson while becoming more capable of taking care of herself and the people around her. The Land of Oz, then, is not a place of literal significance, but metaphorical and psychological import, which are, I suppose, literally significant. All 3 of Dorothy's companions struggle not with material conditions, but mental roadblocks. The Scarecrow claims to not have a brain, and yet his quick thinking allows the group to evade capture in the witch's castle. The Tin Man claims to not have a heart with which to appreciate art, yet sings beautiful songs about the wonders of art. The Lion claims to lack courage, but not only goes on a heroic journey, but conveniently forgets he is a scaredy cat when he stops thinking of himself. Likewise, Dorothy wants to go home, and her magical slippers could have taken her there all along. While each of the 4 has a specific desire they believe will fix their problems, what they truly need is self-discovery, to know themselves better. All 4 place their trust in someone who cannot give them anything, the man behind the curtain. Oz. They want him to solve the problem of their mental roadblocks, which he is incapable of doing for 2 reasons. He's not a true wizard and their problems exist only in their heads, so he sends them on a quest to steal the Wicked Witch's broom, a kind of impossible task to get them off his back. The witch herself is a villain emblematic of the illusory nature of their problems. While she commands powerful magic and an army of winged monkeys, which makes her appear unstoppable, a single bucket of water dissolves her and saves the kingdom. Across the land of Oz, problems are solved with little ingenuity or tact, but through happy accidents, kind words, and imploring others for aid. In this sense, Oz is a mirror to Kansas, where Dorothy and her family do not face insurmountable material problems, but those of communication, of self-worth, and of identity. Dorothy's wanderlust is, after all, not directly related to her family's status as poor farmers in Kansas or a desire to make it rich in the big city, but to experience life up high where dreams come true and troubles melt like lemon drops. She does not evoke the image of royalty or wealth, but that of currencyless bluebirds who fly without a care in the world. The worlds of Oz and Kansas then share common DNA, despite the magical gulf between them. If their problems mirror one another, then so too do their solutions. Dorothy's solution to homesickness is to click her magic shoes together and wake up in Kansas. As we've noted, it was with her all along. Similarly, the solution to her restless desire to travel is to recognize the beauty of what she already has. Thus, despite their wild differences in appearance and tone, the 2 parallel worlds are also places of parallel experience, where developments in one influence and reflect the other. So, let's use this same analytical framework to consider the 2.5 worlds of Omori. Our first step is to identify the most pertinent problems in each world. In Headspace, the group's overarching goal is to find Basil, who has gone missing. Along the way, they participate in miniature episodes in which the group helps find a mixtape for Captain Spaceboy, compete in a bizarre sprout mold dating show, and get jobs working for an Atlantic City-esque casino. In Faraway Town, Sunny and Kel's goal is to bring their group of childhood friends back together and resolve their differences before Sunny moves away. On the face of it, we can see that these 2 narratives dovetail nicely. In both, the player's aim is to make a friend group whole once again, and in both, this problem comes about due to a missing member. While Basil is missing in Headspace, Mari is missing from Faraway Town. The intractable difference is that Mari can't return, as her headstone in the nearby cemetery makes clear. Yet, Headspace has the advantage of hindsight, and from it, we can see how Sunny might have wished things turned out. In Headspace, the quartet of Omori, Kel, and Hiro set out to find Basil by following whatever... In Headspace, the quartet of Omori, Kel, Aubrey, and Hiro set out to find Basil by following whatever leads they can find. This brings them into conflict with everything from strange witches to mafia sharks. While the Wizard of Oz characters all have a desire they wish fulfilled from Oz, the trio of non-player characters lack this kind of definition. While unique and interesting characters in their own right, with Kel and Aubrey often bickering and Hiro playing the role of peacemaker, from the perspective of Sunny's fantasy, this is as good as it gets. They have no need to change. They are, in essence, flawless. The key desire of Headspace, then, is a return to the idyllic existence of the playground. These characters don't have room to grow or improve, but only play the roles of Sunny's imagination, so he might find the peace he lacks in the world of Faraway Town. If this idyllic existence is the want of Sunny's Headspace narrative, Sunny's need is to realize he can never return to those innocent times. The story itself gently guides the character there. Across each episode in Headspace, the arc of their journey trends towards the more mature. Their first journey is simply finding a mixtape for a heartbroken boy, after which he returns to being a fearsome space pirate. By the end of this first story, the childlike is reclaimed. In the second tale, the group take on the malignant Sweetheart. Its romantic subplot with Sweetheart trying to marry Hiro hints at the danger of growing up. But Hiro's rejection of her advances continues Sunny's attempt to retain his childhood. In the final episode, the group now have jobs, symbolizing a new realm of maturity, and Sunny has to fight to get them out from under their contracts so they can just be kids again. By the end of this winding journey of maturation, they also begin to forget their original goal to find Basil, with Omori's friend remarking, "Wasn't there something we were supposed to do?" Yet, despite rescuing them, by this point, the writing is on the wall. The fantasy versions of his childhood friends are growing up. They are ready to move on from the friend group, and it is only Sunny's desire to hold them close that keeps them all together. From here, Sunny will have to confront his need to move on, to mature himself, but that's stories for Section 4 spoilers. Meanwhile, in Faraway Town, Sunny is joined by Kel in an attempt to relive the glory days. The difference from Headspace, of course, being that time has passed. The change in each character's physical appearance and mental situation betrays how different they are from Sunny's imagination. Kel is a tall jock. Hiro is away at college. Basil is a neurotic mess. Aubrey is a bully who leads a gang of misfits. The longer we stay in Faraway Town, the more the world of Headspace feels like a dream, like it has a purpose to keep Sunny young from confronting the fears of growing up. The same problems plague Dorothy, but whereas her response to becoming an adult is wishing to fly far away from where she came from, Sunny's is to put up walls, keep the dream alive, if only in Headspace. Perhaps the most important shift between Headspace and Faraway Town is who has wants and needs, and how they are represented. In Headspace, the group acts as a collective feeling of Sunny's desire for an endless recess, so his wants are front and center for obvious reasons. In Faraway Town, the wants and needs of each individual within the friend group get the spotlight, causing the center of attention to drift away from Sunny, even if he is present in every scene. Aubrey steals Basil's notebook because she wants to preserve an element of the past that Basil wants to forget. Kel wants everyone to get along, but in the process of forced interaction causes physical conflict, including a brawl between Sunny and Basil, and her pushing Basil into a lake. Oof. Basil, clearly traumatized by Sunny, panics upon learning that he's leaving town and doesn't even know what he wants except out. Hiro is the only one of the group who seems capable of giving to everyone else, as he is older, wiser, and actually has managed to move on from their collective tragedy. Yet, what each member of the group needs is more complicated than they let on. Yet, they all need the same thing: reconciliation, a chance to process the trauma of Mari's death. The problem is they can only do this processing together, because their actions after that event, shutting themselves off from one another, deepened their wounds and caused the explosion of emotion we find throughout the Faraway Town narrative. Those emotions bubbling over upon Sunny's reluctant re-entering into their social lives is exactly what Sunny needs in both Faraway Town and in Headspace, as only by experiencing their trauma can Sunny truly start to process his own needs and work toward addressing them. Two intimately related needs rise to the surface for Sunny as he works through the Faraway Town narrative. The first is to break away from Headspace. While Headspace is comfortable and clean, it limits his ability to see or understand those around him. Headspace and Whitespace are, for all intents and purposes, a safety valve to keep Sunny from experiencing the trauma of his sister's death. Yet the longer Sunny is in Faraway Town, the more he realizes he's got to acknowledge what happened to Mari rather than running away from the pain, something we'll discuss in far greater detail in the spoiler-filled Part 4. For now, let's retain our focus on the relationship between Headspace and Faraway Town. The most important aspect of the relationship between these two worlds is their shared protagonist. But as this section of the video winds down, I wonder, are they the same protagonist? Dorothy remains incredibly consistent between Kansas and the Land of Oz. There is no doubt that it is specifically her experiencing the totality of events in the film. Yet, in Omori, this continuity is not so cut and dry. While Sunny seems constant between the two, both expressions of himself distinctly lacking any expression, something is off. The giveaway, in some respects, is the name. In Headspace, our protagonist is Omori, but in Faraway Town, he is Sunny. Initially, this seems just like some alter ego, but the longer one spends in either world, the further apart the characters become. Visually, they are distinct. Omori lacks any color at all, despite walking through the wonderfully painted world of Headspace, while Sunny is in full color in the less buoyant Faraway Town. If Dory feels fully realized over the rainbow when she enters Oz, ostensibly her headspace, Sunny as Omori knows he's muting himself, removing core aspects of his character upon escaping to his. Moreover, Omori is never challenged by his friends within Headspace. He is a statue. He is stagnancy personified, a snapshot in time that cannot move forward. Sunny, meanwhile, is beset on all sides by challenges, rifts, and conflicts which revolve not just around the game's colorful cast of characters, but his own actions, his own personality, and whether or not he can change. The liminal space which rests between Headspace and Faraway Town, that elusive and featureless white space, is perhaps the most obvious clue. While Sunny walks through a door not unlike Dorothy into the land of color that is Headspace, to leave white space for Faraway Town, Sunny must stab himself, killing the vision to wake up. This violent act reveals the distinction between the two characters. Omori and Sunny cannot coexist, which is why, like a pressurized chamber in a spaceship, white space separates them from each other. The crux of Omori's narrative, then, as the protagonist gets ready to move to a new place, is which version of the character stays in Faraway Town, Omori or Sunny? If Omori stays, Sunny can start fresh, break free of the bondage of his trauma. But if Sunny stays, then Omori will perpetually live on as a hikikomori trapped in the vision of the past. These are the stakes of the worlds of Omori, and the player's decisions throughout the narrative inform which path Sunny goes down, whether to embrace the comfort of escapism or the pain of the truth. Still, we're not quite done with Headspace, because I want to tackle the game's rather unique representation of emotion. As my platform on YouTube grows, I always want to be shouting out other creators. So today, I would like to implore you to subscribe to Afterthoughts, link in the description. She makes stellar videos about games, TV, and all different kinds of media. Her most recent video on World of Warcraft and mundanity is incredibly good. If you've made it this far into this video, I can guarantee you'll like her videos too. So please subscribe to her and go check her out once you're done with this one, okay? Games have tremendous ability to generate emotional experiences for their player. Just think about all the raging streamer compilations. While we cry when Jack dies for Rose at the end of the Titanic or at the beginning of Up, we're much more likely to feel emotional about things happening to us because they naturally have more consequence. Games, because we control and embody the characters of narratives, offer an even closer approximation to those things that make us feel emotional. Even as a child, I knew this, whether from the time my brother popped out our Melee disc out of the GameCube and chucked it across the room when I beat him in a game, or the elation I felt when beating Metroid Prime for the first time. No, I'm making it sound like only my little brother was the anger monster in the house. I've raged at many a game in my time, though as I get older, the frustration comes much slower, which is nice. Great games are compelling emotional experiences that reach for the core of what it means to be human, and Omori is one of the most touching experiences I've ever had playing a game. Heck, it made me cry. But that's precisely not what this section is about. Instead of considering how Omori makes its players emotional, I want to look at how Omori represents emotions in its gameplay. So first, a crash course on that. Omori's headspace, which has the most gamey combat of the two worlds, has turn-based combat like many JRPGs, the obvious comparison being Earthbound. During these turns, both enemies and allies can be afflicted with emotions. Think of them as status effects, similar to traditional RPGs poisoned or paralyzed, though less debilitating. These emotions impact each character's base attributes and how they interact with one another. In total, there are 3 different directions each character can head: happy, sad, and angry. Each of these directions has another level where they respectively evolve into ecstatic, depressed, and enraged, and then another level just for Sunny, manic, miserable, and furious. Though some bosses reach that level of emotion as well. Each level naturally exacerbates further the changed attributes and interactions of that status. On a fundamental level, these emotions serve a rock, paper, scissors function. Happy is strong against anger, which is strong against sad, which is strong against happy. If it was as simple as this, honestly, these statuses wouldn't be that interesting. But the game filters most of its interesting mechanics through these emotions. Happy characters have better speed and luck, but a lower hit rate. Angry characters deal more damage, but take more damage. Finally, sad characters take less damage, but have lower speed. Also, some of their damage is converted to juice, the game's mana mechanic for using special abilities. Combat in Omori quickly becomes a game of not just reducing the enemy to 0 HP, but managing a group of children's emotions so that they can fight optimally. Since each enemy also has a propensity for emotion, and special abilities generate emotions like Sunny reading a sad poem or Kel's annoy ability, each fight is a guessing game as to what emotions will best facilitate a victory. While in more mundane encounters, this can lead to repetitive gameplay, as a winning strategy might be to make the enemy sad, then wail on them with your angry party of preteens. In the game's most interesting fights, foes change their feelings and inflict the player's party with a myriad of emotions. The best course of action in these moments is not to follow a prescripted emotional plan, but adapt to the situation and find a new way to victory. While this emotional system is one of the more interesting aspects of Omori's gameplay, it is hardly the first time emotions have been ludicrously represented in a video game. The most obvious emotion that comes to my mind is the Barbarian's Rage mechanic in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. For those of you who aren't total nerds like me, then again, you're watching a multi-hour video on Omori, so who's the real nerd? The Rage mechanic makes the Barbarian take half damage from physical sources and deal bonus damage when it hits. This tracks a bit with the real-life feeling of being furious, does it not? When people grow enraged, they tend to be more violent. They don't hold back their punches. They might not even notice that they've been injured in their adrenaline-fueled rage. But it's not really true to life. at least considering the barbarian is supposed to be a trained fighter, while rage, or the fight part of fight or flight, will make a person more aggressive, and aggression is sometimes good in competitive pursuits, like if you're trying to retake a point in Counter-Strike or score a basket in basketball. It's only productive compared to the flight mechanic's panic, in which a person shuts down or runs away, failing to accomplish anything at all. If you're constantly aggressive and angry, that aggression will be turned against you by a more savvy opponent, which is why most martial arts place a high emphasis on self-discipline and control, because all that training means nothing if the practitioner throws it out the window the second they get into a fight because they're pissed off. Simply put, between two novices, the more aggressive individual may win a confrontation, but between the skilled, blind aggression is a weakness to be exploited. Yet, anger is probably the most gamified emotion. An obvious example would be the God of War series. While there is some aspect of rage in every incarnation of the game, in the most recent God of War, Kratos puts away his weapons and just starts walloping his enemies with his fists. Like the raging barbarian of D&D, he deals more damage and takes less. Above that, he also gets lifesteal off harming his enemies. A similar mechanic can be found in Doom's Berserk power-up, which gives Doomguy increased health and fist damage. In Doom Eternal, Doomguy just starts ripping and tearing demons apart with his bare hands. In one of the more memorable scenes from Splinter Cell Conviction, Sam Reed goes into a frenzy set to a fantastic DJ Shadow song. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Raging is a pretty freaking cool thing to do in video games, specifically because, as we noted above, it tends to promote aggressive play, which is, in turn, more effective and fun than playing it safe. Though sometimes games may want to make the player feel like they should play it safe, and this is sometimes reinforced by giving the characters they control potent emotions of fear. Perhaps the poster child of this mechanic is the sanity effect in the Amnesia series. For those unfamiliar, the longer a character stays in the dark, the stranger reality becomes. The screen may warp or zoom in, their breathing becomes panicked, they may collapse, or may even hallucinate enemies. These effects replicate the emotion of anxiety to show how it plays tricks on the mind and work well as ludic representations of the emotion of fear. As we might expect, these kinds of fear-based emotional triggers are mostly found in horror games, where fear is the point. But where the heck are the other emotions? The only place we consistently find them are in simulation games like SimCity or The Sims, where tracking character emotions is part of the task of running the simulation in the first place. You may have the occasional sadness mechanic in other genres, like how Ness from Earthbound gets homesick when he spends a long time away from home without calling mom. But you're mostly going to find weird exceptions, not things baked into the core of the game. Happy is even more of an outlier. This isn't to say emotions never exist in games, but rarely are they made a core mechanic for the player to engage with. The only one I can think of to truly include multiple emotions as a real-time game mechanic is Super Princess Peach. Oh no, oh god, how did we get here? Super Princess Peach is a Nintendo DS game where the player takes control over the emotional ruler of Mushroom Kingdom. Emotions are, of course, easier to make the core part of your gameplay when a woman is the protagonist, I suppose, because women are more emotional than men, I guess. While generally a traditional 2D platformer, Super Princess Peach's central gimmick are Peach's vibe powers, where her emotions create external realities. The joy vibe will draw wind to Peach so she can float. The rage vibe will cause flames to erupt from her, like Goku going Super Saiyan. The gloom vibe causes Peach to run faster and can put out fires. Finally, the calm vibe will restore health. Perhaps the most interesting thing about the way these emotions are implemented is that they are all tied to the same limited resource, the vibe meter. I kind of love this take on emotions in an abject sense, the idea that you only have so much energy to feel emotional, and after a while you just become numb. Unfortunately, that's not actually representative of reality. When people just stew in their anger for a long time, it seems to me they just become like permanently angry all the time. I have my own experiences with sadness and depression, which act similarly, but more on that in part 4. You will stay around for part 4, right? That's going to be the best part. I'm going to get sad. I'm getting sad just thinking about you leaving early. Super Princess Peach notwithstanding, I think emotions outside of rage are difficult to gamify because emotions are tricky to define. We know them more by their feeling than by some literal description. I mean, the Google definition of sadness is literally the condition or quality of being sad. That's not helpful. The games that deal best with emotions, like Celeste, tend to treat them as abstractions of narrative and plot rather than game mechanics. Though Celeste does have one of the best ludic examples of coming to terms with yourself I've ever experienced in a video game. So before we return to Omori's ludic representation of emotions, let's turn to perhaps our most salient and easy to understand pop media representation of emotion, Pixar's 2015 movie, Inside Out. Inside Out presents emotions as having their own distinct identities within a person's brain. In it, we follow the inner machinations of a child's mind as she tries to adjust to moving to a new place. A surprisingly similar plot to Omori, where we follow the inner emotional machinations of a young person as he prepares to leave a familiar place. On a broad level, these are both stories about profound change during the foundational years of a person's life. Yet, while Sunny's story is about learning to cope and overcome past trauma, Riley's story is about how a person reacts to a traumatic experience in the moment. The most inventive aspect of Inside Out is its personification of emotion, which can be useful as we seek to understand the significance of Omori's gamified emotion chart. Joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust are the core emotions that comprise Riley's brain, each representing cultural conceptions of what those emotions are. And wouldn't you know it, 4 of these 5 emotions are conditions characters have at various moments in Omori's combat system. While fear isn't within the triangle of emotions, it does occur with relative frequency when Sunny, not Omori, finds himself in combat alone, particularly in the elusive black space we'll cover a little bit more in part 4. Inside Out's emotions are first and foremost caricatures of those emotions as they are culturally understood. Anger, for instance, is foul-mouthed, aggressive, and literal fire erupts from his head when he's enraged. Sadness, meanwhile, is dopey and slow, tending towards introspection rather than extroversion. The core of the cast, though, is Joy, the chipper and happy-go-lucky self-proclaimed boss of the emotions, whose actions nearly lead to the full destruction of Riley's mind. Joy's problem is that she's too focused on making Riley happy, disregarding the need for any other emotions, but in the process bottling them up and causing Riley's emotional makeup to go haywire. The message of the film at its most simple level is that sometimes it's good to feel your emotions, even when you're hurting. In Inside Out, just as in Omori's combat, the relationship between emotions causes tension and introspection. Joy is constantly dismissive of sadness, trying to keep her away from Riley's emotional controls and blaming her for the problems that befall Riley. The two end up separated from Riley and in the process finally get to know each other a little bit better. Meanwhile, anger takes over the controls for Riley and in a bout of bad judgment decides what she truly needs is to go back home to Minnesota. Again, this is quite similar to Sunny's headspace, which is constructed to go back to a time when the friend group was whole, rather than its fractured present. The primary difference between them is that Sunny's desire to go back appears prompted by a withdrawn sadness rather than a deluded aggression, falsely believing that things can go back to normal with a change in location. But just as Sunny can't go back in time, Riley can't just go back to Minnesota and have everything return to how it was. Understanding this truth is Riley's core need within the world of the film. She wants to go back to Minnesota, but she needs to accept her new situation and make the best of it. Learn that change doesn't have to be bad. In order to accomplish this, all her emotions need to work in harmony. The pivotal moment being when Joy realizes one of Riley's most happy moments was preceded by one of her most sad. That juxtaposition making each emotion stronger and more meaningful. In a way, Omori's combat triangle is these emotions working together. Whereas the emotions of Inside Out are characters which drive the plot, Sunny's emotions are mechanics which drive how we are to understand him and these characters. So let's take a closer look at the relationship between Omori's three most defined emotions. Let's start with the bare stats each one is accompanied with. Anger does more damage, but takes more damage, essentializing how anger can lead to success, but also leaving someone wide open to be hurt due to lack of discipline. Sadness has increased defense, probably because they are more withdrawn, kind of like a turtle in a shell, and is slower, just like a turtle in a shell, likely because they aren't paying as close attention though. Sadness also converts some physical damage to juice or psychic damage. If we're thinking about Earthbound's similar mechanic, PP or psychic points, which implies that the sad individual internalizes the damage they take mentally rather than physically. Finally, happiness is faster, more prone to act, and luckier, perhaps making their own luck because of their positive disposition, but is less likely to hit, maybe because they are less likely to see things as they really are in their optimistic eyes. These are mostly inferences based on how I feel about emotion, but I don't think we need to make guesses to understand the relationship between these emotions. Why have a triangle of emotions which are strong against one another? What does that tell us about those feelings? In some ways, I think each Omori arrow actually points in the opposite direction, asking if the more powerful emotion might be the solution to the problem. Happy beats angry because it's active enough to calm anger down, whereas sad in its withdrawn nature passively struggles to engage. Anger beats sad for the same reason that aggression beats panic. At least anger results in doing something rather than nothing. Finally, sad beats happy because it rains on its parade, showing a different and more negative picture of the world that happy can't easily reconcile. While I can see a relationship between these emotions, I don't find them all that compelling, but I think that's the point. None of these emotions reign supreme, are equivocally better than the other. This part of the game offers no solutions to emotional troubles. Instead, these are the musings of Sunny's headspace. Just how he simplifies emotions into game mechanics in his head, he simplifies how these emotions react with one another. The illusion of these emotions is shattered once he has to step into faraway town and actually interact with other people, whose emotions are far more complex than his chart might lead someone to believe. Yet, there is a truth to the emotional chart, but instead of looking at the arrows, perhaps we should look at who represents each emotion. Kel represents happy, Aubrey represents anger, and Hero represents sad. All of these can be construed as their individual responses to Mari's death, exacerbated because these may have been the emotions the characters were predisposed to in the first place, based on their interactions in headspace at least, and their recollections of their collective childhood. Kel, ever the happy kid, tried to smooth over Mari's death by just ignoring it and focusing on the positive. Hiro, who was not just Mari's friend but her romantic partner as well, fell into a deep depression. Aubrey, frustrated by how no one seemed to care or want to talk about it, grew angry. In Faraway Town, particularly Aubrey and Kel are consumed by these emotions. Aubrey's anger causes her to fly into violent rages, and she is the enemy of the party on multiple occasions. Kel, meanwhile, seems completely unable to understand why she's so angry or Basil so anxious, specifically because everything he sees is filtered through optimistic eyes. Just like how the two worlds of Omori mirror each other, so too do the ways they portray emotion. Headspace's ludified emotion mechanics push the player towards thinking about how the characters in Faraway Town deal with their emotions, and in turn consider how they, the player, might deal with their own emotions when push comes to shove. The point is simple. If we were to remove the emotional labels from Omori's emotion chart, let's say we rename them fire type, grass type, and water type, would the game still work? Imagine for a second that you even got to do really neat water and grass versions of each of the characters. That could be fun. One of the game's sections is in the belly of a whale, another is in a forest, and another is in a desert. This practically writes itself. And yet, the answer is super obvious. Absolutely not. Even though Headspace is a fantasy realm where anything can happen, as we discussed in the previous section, it has immense symbolic importance for the events of Faraway Town. It sets up how we are supposed to read and understand the other worlds of the game. This mechanic, introduced before we even enter Faraway Town, teaches us Omori is first and foremost a game about emotion, where feelings take priority over reality. No, where they construct reality. On its most fundamental level, Omori wants to show the player their emotional disposition shapes how they see the world and how they interact with it. And along the way, it shows every viable extreme that those emotions can cause. As we found examples of emotions from other games, from Dungeons & Dragons to Super Princess Peach, it's not their use as a mechanic in Omori that makes the game interesting, but how we can apply them to its narrative at large. How these mechanics communicate the game's themes and ideas, particularly how trauma exacerbates a person's emotional responses and constructs their reality. So, now that we're primed to consider Omori as a game where emotions are front and center, as much so as in a film like Inside Out, it's time to talk about how the game develops these emotions for its tear-jerking finale. At this point, we're going into full spoiler territory. If you have not played Omori and my description of its two worlds, emotional charts, and cultural context intrigues you, I sincerely ask that you subscribe, join the Discord, and Patreon if you're so inclined. Put this on your watch later tab and then get out of here. Go buy Omori right now. I honestly believe most games can be spoiled and be fully enjoyed, but Omori's spoilers completely change the tone and meaning of the game. They aren't for a YouTube video to teach you. That said, if you're vibing with this video and you don't want to play Omori, hey, I can't stop you from leaving. Enjoy. Okay, with that out of the way, let's pull this train out of the station. But first, super trigger warning for suicide and self-harm. Like all good things, Omori must end. Surprisingly, considering it's a JRPG, it manages to reach an ending before the 100-hour mark. But even so, this story, all these emotions and threads we've been pulling on, need to come to some kind of conclusion, and wowee, they do not disappoint. I'm going to give you a long crash course on what happens over the last few days in Faraway Town so that we're on the same page. Then we're going to talk about the massive spoilers, otherwise known as the truth. On day 1 in Faraway Town, Cal and Sunny have a nice visit to the park, or at least it was nice until the pair find Basil begging Aubrey for something she evidently took and won't give back. Aubrey's friends, the hooligans, then try to start a physical confrontation, but they back off when they learn Sunny has a knife out. They learn that Aubrey stole Basil's photo album, but are unsure as to why. The pair get into a fight with Aubrey at church and later retrieve it from her trash. Sunny has a conversation with Basil and notices that he too is haunted by a similar apparition to the one that burdens him. Basil is traumatized, and our boy Sunny just leaves him to panic in the bathroom. Returning home, Sunny is traumatized by visions of his sister, begging the player to ask what happened between them. No answers will be given for some time. On day 2, Sunny and Cal get into another confrontation with Aubrey's hooligans because they're bullying Basil yet again. After a fight, the hooligans leave, giving us our first truly alone meeting between the old friends. Aubrey wants them to leave her alone, which is ironically exactly what they did after Mari's death to alienate her in the first place. She says Basil is the worst because he wants to erase the past altogether, and in a moment of frustration, accidentally shoves him into a lake. Sunny, despite his fear of drowning, jumps in after Basil. After a short psychological battle under the water where Sunny envisions Mari saving him just like she did once when they were kids, Hero shows up just in time to rescue Basil and Sunny. Basil needs time to recover, but the trio, Cal, Hero, and Sunny, spend the night at Sunny's place, making a pillow fort and reminiscing about old times. Looking at Basil's photo album, they notice that Aubrey took every photo with Mari in them. That night, Sunny begins his adventure in Headspace as Omori looking for Mari at the pier. She helps him overcome his fear of drowning, and the two swim to find their friends. Mari tells him he can overcome the specter that haunts him, and even addresses him by Sunny before becoming some kind of spirit. After a winding adventure in Headspace, Omori enters Black Space. Similar in structure to White Space, Black Space is the deepest reaches of Sunny's mind. As he explores its doors, the game potently evokes the psychological horrors and mysteries of Yumi Nikki. Eventually, Omori reaches Basil in Red Space, but as Basil begs forgiveness, Omori stabs him, and Sunny wakes up. Interestingly, Sunny has previously only woken up when he stabs himself, indicating that Headspace is Basil, maybe more than just a vision. Sunny hears his sister's piano playing in the other room, and he sees Mari's spirit playing it. She talks about the duet they were supposed to play together, but never got to, and asks if he wants to play it now, but they're interrupted by Hero, and the two process their pain over losing Mari together. The next day, they learn that Aubrey is in dire straits. They go to her, and Hero uses his charm to help them reconcile their differences. Basil rushes to the hospital to be with his grandma, whose health is failing. The rest of them visit their treehouse and restore the photo album. Aubrey reveals that Basil had blacked Mari out of all the pictures, which is why she was tormenting him so much. We learn that Mari died the day of her and Sunny's recital, having committed suicide. The group have a big hug, and it really feels like they're finally expressing their emotions to each other. The group heads to Basil's house, but due to the situation with his grandma, he is distraught and locked in his room. They spend the night there to comfort him if he needs it. While sleeping, Sunny finds he has not become Omori. Instead, Omori just sits in White Space menacingly. After facing his fears, and specifically a big reveal that the phantom that haunts Sunny is the visage of his sister's hanging body, Sunny meets Basil once again in Headspace, where they resolve themselves to face the truth. It's here where I want to stop for a moment. I know it's been a long-winded exposition of what exactly is going on in Omori, but it's important because I want to talk about why this story, before the major spoiler, meant so much to me. How it was already one of my favorite game stories of all time before I even finished it. Omori is fundamentally a story about the profound impact death has on those it leaves behind. Each of the main characters is not just changed by Mari's death, but broken by it. We see a wide variety of emotional responses to this event, from profound depression to white-hot rage to devastating withdrawal. Each of these emotional responses connected with me on a deep level. I've suffered from white-hot rage due to trauma in my life. I've been profoundly depressed. I've withdrawn from the world, from friends and family, pushing others away out of a misguided desire to be safe. Seeing this group of friends torn apart by loss, I didn't just see a story. I found versions of myself in each one of them. When I saw Aubrey push Basil into the lake, I knew that I was capable of that in a fit of passion. When I saw Cal try to push an optimism to smooth over the pain of loss, I saw myself doing the same thing. When I saw Sonny withdraw into his own psyche, so much so that it required harming himself to escape, I couldn't help but be reminded of times in my life where I wanted to hurt myself that bad if only to feel something, anything at all. I particularly empathized with Basil, not just his fearful and panicked interior mental state, though I honestly felt it resembled much of the pain I've experienced in my life, but because of his relationship with his grandma. I lost my grandma just over a year before playing Omori, and growing up she was probably the person in the world I was closest to, who I trusted the most. Seeing him go through the same struggle of losing his grandma while also dealing with the trauma of seeing his best friend Sonny skip town endeared me so much to the character. As I got further and further into Omori, it became incredibly difficult for me to not feel a wealth of emotions every time I booted up the game. Yet, Omori made me want to feel these emotions, see these childhood friends reconcile their differences, overcome their trauma together. And as it became clearer throughout the narrative that Mari had killed herself, I couldn't help but feel like the game was even more speaking to me directly, as I've intimately dealt with a loved one committing suicide. The scar that leaves on you is tremendous and doesn't ever seem to fully go away. Mentally, I'm still haunted by it. I'm torn up inside. I felt guilty for a long time, wishing I had done things differently, blaming myself for not being enough. But over time, I was able to recognize the flaws in those emotions and work to repair myself. But I still feel the need to carry on their memory. Like a part of them lives on inside of me, but only if I cultivate it and keep it alive. Simply put, I miss my friend, but nothing I can do can fix that. Trigger warnings are weird segue. Trigger warnings are incredibly valuable tools, and it's wonderful that Omori begins with a long list of triggers to watch out for. But while I would say Omori triggered all these emotions in me, I was immensely glad that it did. It gave me a space to process and unearth all these emotions I had kept buried out of necessity and feel them all over again. These emotions meant so much more to me, specifically because they were juxtaposed with the humor of Sonny's headspace, because I could see myself in the game's characters, because I had experienced similar events. Then, the game revealed the truth, which unfortunately complicated my catharsis. The truth, we learn, is that Sonny accidentally killed Mari. Mari kept prodding him to play the duet perfect, and Sonny threw his violin down the stairs in frustration. Mari started yelling at him, and he pushed her. She fell down the stairs and onto Sonny's violin and hit her head, dying. He picked her up and brought her to bed, mourning her while retreating into white space for the first time. Basil, though, showed up to the recital early and understood that it was an accident, but worried about what it would all look like. Together, they staged Mari's suicide, and as they turned back toward her now hanging body, they saw one eye staring at them through her mess of hair. The image that has haunted them the entire game. If I'm giving the game the benefit of the doubt, this twist is supposed to put the rest of the narrative into context. Think about how other big twists function, like those from The Sixth Sense or Planet of the Apes. In those stories, the twist is like the line block completing a Tetris. Everything makes sense and works afterwards. In this case, we suddenly see why Sunny and Basil have been plagued by a similar something, which haunts them and seemingly connects their headspaces together. They did something truly heinous. Sunny copes with it through withdrawal. Basil, just as burdened by the truth, is plagued by anxiety and panic attacks, unable to cope with what he's done. Him physically trying to scratch out Mari's existence from his photo album is the faraway town version of how Sunny invents an entire alternate reality to forget how Mari really died. In a sense, we finally understand now why these two characters, more so than any others in the friend group, seem mentally debilitated by Mari's death. Yet, experiencing the twist for the first time, I couldn't help but feel underwhelmed, insulted even. Here I was, someone who experienced many of the same emotions of Sunny and Basil in my life, who had empathized with these characters and saw myself in them, suddenly being shown that they truly had an action to feel guilty for. Meanwhile, I never killed anyone or staged a suicide, yet I carry a similar sense of guilt and loss. Thus, the twist ripped me out of the story, made me feel, at least momentarily, the game communicated that these emotions were somehow privileged for those who had done terrible things, rather than those emotions being a natural outcropping of losing someone you love, of being a child and growing up with trauma. The disconnect between how I emotionally related to the game and the truth threatened to ruin my entire experience of the game. My wife and I played Omori together, and I turned to her and immediately voiced a version of what I just said, and I almost lost interest in finishing the game altogether. But I'm glad I didn't. While I still agree with everything I just said, specifically that the truth undermines the player's empathetic relationship with Sunny and Basil, what the game does with the twist matters more than what the twist is, and it ultimately redeems itself by using the twist to change the nature of the story. Up until the truth, Omori is a story about loss, grief, pain, and trauma. It elicits all of the emotions I've described in a genuine and sincere manner. No twist could change that. Yet, after the truth, Omori becomes a story about forgiveness. Perhaps this is the real twist, the real subverted expectation. We may have always expected that Sunny and company could turn the ship around, overcome their grief, but it isn't until we see in heartbreaking detail the specific cause of Sunny and Basil's malady that the game can begin to address healing their woes in a meaningful manner. And boy, does the narrative after the reveal truly shine or just go crazy. Later in the evening, after everyone else has gone to sleep, Sunny confronts Basil in the bathroom, both consumed by the darkness that haunts them. They fight, and Basil stabs Sunny in the eye before they both pass out, and Sunny enters headspace for the last time. He finds Mari playing her piano. She tells him she will always look after him and encourages him to forgive himself. From here, Sunny can go find the broken violin and the sheet music for the siblings' recital. The pair of items takes him to Memory Lane, where he relives significant memories of Mari and his friends, connecting on a deeper level with his emotions rather than pushing them away. Finishing these memories, Sunny finds himself backstage with not his headspace friends, but their faraway town counterparts. Like Mari, they tell Sunny to reveal the truth and forgive himself. He gets on stage and starts playing the recital by himself, but before he can finish, he breaks down and cries. Omori then rips Sunny from the stage and back into white space, but it's too late. The pain Sunny bottled up for so long is boiling over. The final boss fight commences, but Omori is not fallible like the other Headspace bosses, and try as Sunny might, the only option is to fail. The player does not necessarily know this though, and they are given the option to quit or continue. Selecting continue allows Sunny to get up, this time with his violin in hand. No longer does he fight Omori with violence, but with music. As he plays his violin, the specter of his sister, that ghost which has haunted him the entire narrative, begins to play with him. The game moves to a music video-esque cutscene where the duo finally play their beautiful song together. The visuals display his entire life with Mari and the gang. As it concludes, Mari and her piano fade away, and Sunny returns to white space. He collapses into Omori, who gives him a hug and drops his knife. Then, like Mari, he evaporates. Sunny leaves a white space and finds himself in the hospital. He finds Basil's room filled with all his friends, and the game ends on a scribbled note of Sunny's words to them. I have something to tell you. Omori's ending hits hard. In the span of 20 or 30 minutes, it doesn't just manage to wrap up a complicated story that stretches across multiple planes of existence while touching on various issues of mental health, but it elevates an already great game into another stratosphere. It's funny. In my Ultra Kill and Sekiro videos, I applauded those games for key bosses that emulated and affirmed how the player was supposed to play the game in the first place. For Ultra Kill, that was playing fast and loose. For Sekiro, it was methodically parrying. I noted how narratively both of these bosses were mirrors toward the player character. Here in Omori though, we see a completely different side of the story. Sunny's final boss is not just a doppelganger. It is literally himself, or at least a psychological representation of his trauma. The most beautiful thing about this fight is that there's no way to beat your way out of it. Throughout the time in Headspace, the player has gotten used to figuring out sly ways to manipulate emotions in the interest of pounding bad guys. But none of these lessons apply for beating Omori, because there is no physical attack that removes Omori from Sunny's mind. No breathing technique or mental trick to remove guilt. Guilt only leaves when you forgive yourself. Thus, Sunny's path to redemption must go through the manifestation of his guilt, not around it. In the end, no matter what you do, you can't avoid yourself. The most obvious allegory to Omori's ending is the story of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Sunny literally dies to Omori, only to be resurrected by the player and spiritually rejuvenated through forgiveness. I am personally a religious person, so I think that's why the ending touched me so profoundly. But you don't have to be spiritual to see the profound significance of forgiving oneself. We're all prone to errors, and everyone's got a pile of regrets, whether big or small. The importance of the truth in Omori is that it gives the player a tangible way to understand past mistakes through an overly dramatic premise, so the player can reach the point where they know Sunny needs to forgive himself, and in playing that out with his sister in a beautiful montage of their relationship, understand that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, which is what Sunny's been trying to do, but accepting the past. That moving on doesn't mean erasure, but disclosure. Hiding a wound makes it fester. Getting help allows it to heal. Omori's ending, though, as I hinted when I tried to wave off would-be watchers who haven't seen it at the start of the section, only lands if you've truly grown connected to these characters, if you identify with Sunny and care for his well-being. I'm someone who generally believes that most video game stories are stories only games could tell if you dig deep enough, but Omori is special in how it ropes the player into its story of forgiveness. It uses its two worlds as a kind of bait and switch. The Land of Headspace is an Earthbound-inspired RPG, sure, but Faraway Town is there to hit you with the real world. But instead of dissolving into fatalism, more on that in a moment, the game pivots to an amazingly portrayed lesson on self-forgiveness and personal growth. I appreciate so much that despite being about depression, as some naysayers might say, the game manages to not feel like a depressing romp, or like Yumi Nikki, which ends with the main character committing suicide. Wait, what's that? There's multiple endings? Yeah. The presence of diverging paths is probably the biggest video game ism in Omori, but in general, when I encounter multiple endings in a game, as I kind of hinted at in my Sekiro video, I'm more interested in how they bolster my reading of whatever I view as the significant ending, or the most important one. So, let's do a quick look at the game's other endings to see what they tell us about Sunny's story. The most obvious diverging path is if the player refuses to leave their house and join Kel. In this alternate reality, the player spends their faraway town time doing chores by themselves and exploring Headspace. On this, the Omori route, Omori saves Sunny from the truth when it comes up. In the end, Sunny moves away from faraway town with the still ambiguous ghost of his sister following him, or accidentally stabs himself in his sleep while trying to leave Whitespace. Basil ends up safe from the truth in Headspace, but kills himself in real life. In all instances, the message is pretty clear. If you don't face your fears and continue to avoid them in delusional fantasies, there is no chance for growth, just perpetual stagnation. Omori and Whitespace, psychological seatbelts made to protect Sunny, become more powerful than him in the end and envelop him. Finally, if the player chooses not to continue the fight against Omori, they reach what the wiki calls the bad ending. Sunny wakes up in the hospital after his fight with Basil, but rather than reveal the truth to his friends, he realizes he can never forgive himself for what he's done, and jumps off the roof of the hospital. In this ending, we see that if one confronts their guilt but can't learn to forgive themselves, they will pursue a reckless self-destruction rather than let it come out. It's worth noting, every ending of Omori is bitter, because the premise of Omori, a boy filled with despair and guilt, is bitter. But that lack of sweetness does not make Omori a nihilistic story. Instead, in the bitterness of its most potent ending of self-forgiveness, we find the strength to carry on, continue living with memories of loved ones rather than hiding them away in elaborate headspaces, is healthy, not just for the individual, but their entire community. As Sunny's revelation at the end of the narrative is surely good for the whole group, as evidenced by this secret ending, where Basil and Sunny's black specters finally dissipate and the pair smile at each other. As we can see, there is so much to love about Omori, from its fantastical setting to its well-defined characters, to its humor, to its heartbreaking revelations. But the fan community around Omori is exceptionally big for such a small indie game. So, in the next section, we're going to consider how this wonderful game came to cultivate such a huge following, and how that following adds, or subtracts, meaning to an already meaningful game. We can't talk about Omori without at least dipping our toes into its massive fan culture. So let's dip our toe in. How overwhelming could it be? Oh, that's actually quite a lot. That's okay, we've got time. You've already been here for 4 whole sections of my nonsense, so what's one more? Simply put, Omori would not exist without its fan culture. I don't mean the fans create a substantial amount of the cultural significance of Omori. I mean, literally, the game is the result of both verbal and financial support from fans. The game came about because so many people vied with Amokat's initial comic depicting a hikikomori kid in Fantasyland, and the subsequent Kickstarter's massive support allowed the game to grow into what it became today. So, it's impossible to divorce what Omori is from how its fans helped create what it is through their engagement. Still, I'd also like to say, Omori would not exist without its fan culture. This time, I do mean the fans create a substantial amount of the cultural meaning of Omori. The fan culture of Omori is just as important to understanding the story of the game as playing the game is, because our understanding of what a game means is not just individually experienced, but socially constructed. In this section, I'd like to try to understand better how the meme culture around Omori reflects how its fans understand the game and its meaning, while trying to understand on a broader scale how fan interaction changes all games and media. To get there, we should probably lay some foundation for this old theoretical house we're building. Fan studies is an entire field of academic study, and I'm not going to purport here to be an expert in it or try to represent the whole caboodle. Instead, I want to look at some basic principles from one of its seminal books, Henry Jenkins's Textual Poachers, Television Fans and Participatory Culture, and consider how the characteristics of a fan community Jenkins discussed 30 years ago matches up with our Omori fan community today. Textual Poachers is a unique book for its time because it didn't look at fandoms as unnatural, crazy, or bizarre, which many cultural depictions of fans, rampant from TV shows that mention Trekkies to academics trying to explain the phenomenon of fandom, try to replicate. Instead, Jenkins describes himself as a fan and celebrates fandom as a unique and important part of culture. He specifically says he wants to redefine the public image of fandom and encourage a greater awareness of the richness of fan culture. Some of his discussions around mass culture feel muted today because media culture has become significantly fractured since the comparatively monolithic period television captivated the Western, specifically American, world. Perhaps ironically then, given the massive gap in time between Jenkins' book and this video, the first point I'd like to note about fandom is that it is never fixed, but acts more as a river you can never step in twice. Or as Jenkins puts it,
there's nothing timeless and unchanging about this culture. Fandom originates in response to specific historical conditions and remains constantly in flux.
I bring this up for a few reasons, but primarily because the Omori fan culture of today will continue to change beyond this video. Who knows? If this video, which is a work of fandom, reaches a critical mass, it may also change the fandom in one way or another. Maybe someone will make a meme out of me. Basically, I want to give you a snapshot of how I see the Omori community as I write this script, even if I am personally more of a lurker in the fandom than a creator. Though, I suppose that changes the moment I click publish on this video, doesn't it? That's one of the tricky aspects of fandom, especially for a fan. How much is talking about the fandom talking about me and my experience of it, and how much of the discussion is me trying to step away from my own understanding and look at it more holistically? In general, you can expect me to filter my view of the community through my own analytical lens, particularly because I am interested in a rather singular question. What does the Omori fandom say about Omori? I would rather be upfront about this disposition because I don't view it as an entirely negative thing. As Jenkins explains,
I am dismayed by general theories of television spectatorship that give little attention to the specificity and complexity of the practices I experience as a fan. I am equally troubled by the inadequacy with which many academics write about popular culture, and particularly our inability to link ideological criticism with an acknowledgement of the pleasures we find within popular texts.
I have similar troubles. I believe that generalized theories of media studies are sometimes applied in attempts to remove the writer from the equation, but are often used in ways that allow the author to assert their own opinions or predilections without meaningful contest. So, you could say I'm falling off the other side of the horse. I am asserting my own opinion here, my own reading of the Omori fandom. Feel free to contest it. Obviously, I am writing this and I take ownership of my words, but moreover, it's important to acknowledge that I am a fan, writing about something that I am a fan of, and of other fans of the thing. What exactly is a fandom, though? There are quite a few definitions floating around in the ether, but we'll go with a few lines from Jenkins' book about the title of his book.
Textual Poachers describes a social group struggling to define its own culture and to construct its own community within the context of what many observers have described as a postmodern era. It documents a group insistent on making meaning from materials others have characterized as trivial and worthless.
The key words as they relate to the Omori fandom are trivial and worthless. Let's back up for a second and remember that the Earthbound-inspired RPG Rattlings we encountered way back on the other end of this video, while you, viewer who is self-selected out of the group by watching a multi-hour Omori video, may not view the game as trivial, many gamers sick of games about depression are. Moreover, it's worth considering how a community formed not around a giant marketing blitz like Overwatch or Valorant might construct itself differently. Fans are fans, regardless of the circumstance, but the network of those individuals is profoundly shaped by what they are fans of, and in turn, those fans shape the meaning of their collective fixation. People become fans for all sorts of reasons, but what I find particularly true of all fan communities I'm a part of are some lines from Jenkins' conclusion.
Fans are concerned with the particularity of textual detail and with the need for internal consistency. They create strong parallels between their own lives and the events of the series.
As we saw from the previous section discussion, The Truth, I cultivated viewing the game not just as a piece of media about some cute and well-drawn characters, but as an extension of myself. Seeing the characters as not just representative of some external ideals, but of internal realities I faced in my own life. The transformative interactions fans have with media is incredibly powerful and leads to the desire to find other people with similar experiences, share notes, have conversations, gush over what they love, and in those interactions generate a fan culture. Understanding what fandoms are does not necessarily help us understand how they come about, though. For every Star Trek, Twin Peaks, or Supernatural, there are hundreds of potential franchises that fail to launch, or rather, do not manage to engender a fan culture. At times, it can feel like the intensity of fandom just isn't there, even for big media properties. But more importantly, we should recognize that not every follower is a fan. I've seen pretty much every Marvel movie, yet I wouldn't consider myself a Marvel fan. I own no Marvel merchandise, I don't participate in any online discussions about Marvel, and I wouldn't consider it part of my identity. I'm not interested in gatekeeping who is or isn't a fan. Rather, I'm interested in asking what's going on with the people who do participate in online discussions, who do make memes, who do write fan fiction, who do seek out a community of like-minded people to feel like they belong. I'm interested in creating a composite picture of the Omori fan by looking at the kinds of interactions with the game that they celebrate. Before we get to that though, let's try to understand the underlying principles of why Omori has a cult following in the first place. After all, there are relatively few indie games with such passionate communities. Undertale and Terraria may come to mind, but for every one of those, there are literally hundreds of indie games that sold about as well as Omori, but lack its vibrant community. Probably the best way to start wrapping your head around this, if you're familiar with fan cultures or the Omori fandom, is to look at some stats. The Omori subreddit has more members than indie games with much bigger cultural impacts, like Celeste or Shovel Knight, and is incredibly active. The subreddit cracks the top 1,000 most active subreddits most days, matching the activity of much larger fandoms of powerhouse franchises like Mario, Zelda, and Resident Evil. I am not the arbiter of why Omori's fandom is so spirited, but I'd like to take a stab at understanding where all this energy comes from, or rather, why Omori? The simplest explanation is probably the amazing art style of the game. Omori's look ranges from pixel-drawn SNES-inspired towns to beautiful hand-drawn characters to surreal and complicated pieces of abstract art. It's quite impressive that the game manages to pull off creating a coherent vision from this mishmash of styles, but the quality is certainly here. As a result of this fantastic art direction, Omori's characters are instantly recognizable and relatively easy to draw yourself. Thus, much of the work that comprises the Omori subreddit is fan art of the game's characters. Other fandoms that celebrate simple but defined drawn characters like Steven Universe or Undertale are also quite popular. Simply put, the fact that just about any aspiring artist can pick up their pen and paper and get something that looks approximately like Omori's characters goes a long way to encouraging people to get in on the fan art action. Fan art then leads to more people staying and engaging with other people on a forum like Reddit, making it a more active place to engage with fellow fans. Another aspect that contributes to the game's fandom is its humor and memery, and this stems directly from the broad and yet specific characterization of its primary cast. Sunny is a pensive and quiet child, and much of the humor around him plays up his muted character. Kel, though, is quite the opposite. He is a meme lord, loud, brash, and physical, well-meaning but not particularly bright. The androgynous Basil, center of many memes, is incredibly troubled but also so damn cute that everyone on the subreddit simultaneously has nothing actually bad to say about him and rushes to defend him. Aubrey is an aggressive tomboy with a mean streak but a soft heart. While the other characters certainly have definable characteristics and find their way into many memes, they tend to, ever so slightly, less be the topic of fan content. And I think this is because they are generally more normal members of the cast. Still, if you're familiar with tier lists, Omori character tier lists tend to just pretty much put all the characters at the top in the S tier. It's not just the characters themselves that center around memes either, it's their relationships. People love shipping Sunny with Aubrey or Basil, and the ill-defined sexual orientations or romantic relationships within the main text of the game outside of Hiro and Mari allows the fandom to go hog wild with their own theories and interpretations. In a sense, everyone has a piece of the Omori character pie and are able to construct them in their imagination as they see fit. These relationships also find their way into memes. For instance, the boisterous Kel is a great foil to the solemn Sunny, and along with the other characters, these relationships and the fan humor they generate are like a Sunday comic strip of potential. If the characters were more defined, it would be more difficult to craft jokes around them. But if they were less specific, fans wouldn't have the ability for each comic to be so legible to anyone who has played the game. Essentially, Omori's characters hit a sweet spot of memeability that isn't easily planned or replicated, at least in my estimation. The game's idiosyncratic nature also contributes to its active fandom. Omori's headspace is a place of surprising possibility. It contains a facsimile of a Kool-Aid man running around and beating up children, a pop star who controls an entire nation of saprolings, a rogue moon that fast travels the characters between destinations, an underwater casino run by sharks. Rarely, if ever, are these details explored to their fullest possibilities, and thus the fandom burdens themselves with fleshing out these concepts and ideas, iterating and reiterating on them until they become fleshed out, part of the shared culture. The sheer amount of questions Omori's idiosyncrasies bring to the table, in conjunction with the game's catch-all reasoning that it's maybe all in Sunny's head, means the game's fiction is a playground for the audience to explore. Moreover, the ambiguous nature of the narrative, with its many endings, gives fans plenty of fodder for imagining their own versions of the story and how it plays out. The ambiguity of the narrative also gives way to many fan theories as to what Omori means, how it communicates this message, and how the player is supposed to understand the game, which is kind of what this video is. As no one answer to the question, what is the meaning of Omori, or even truly what happens in Omori, can possibly be 100% correct, the audience takes it upon themselves to come up with their own personalized answers to these questions. Shipping characters together, despite the relative lack of in-game cause to do so, is perhaps the biggest example of this. Thus, love triangles, like the ones fantasized between Sunny, Aubrey, and Basil, give way to all sorts of memes, like this one about bisexuality. We only see the events of the story unfold from Sunny's perspective. We are not privy to the headspaces of other characters, and thus, while they are broadly understood by their simple characteristics, a depth lurks beneath them. This depth is perhaps best on display in the copious amounts of fan fiction written about Omori and his characters. The nearly 4,000 entries on Archive of Our Own, while not a world beater, is still pretty significant and reveals just how much people want to expand the story of Omori with their own imagination. Remember, the size and activity of the Omori community is relative to its size as a relatively unknown indie game. One way to put it may be, most everyone who plays Omori ends up spending loads of time engaging with the fandom, whether by writing or reading fanfiction, creating or upvoting memes, or by watching elaborate YouTube videos about the game. The one you happen to be watching is just one of many, and yet, as I write this, I sincerely hope I'm carving out a unique space of Omori discussion. While all of these attributes contribute to Omori's feverish fandom, the most important one is the game's emotional resonance with players. You may have noticed by now, but at no point in this elaborate review have I, or will I, comment on the game's portrayal of mental illness at length. For that kind of analysis, I recommend taking a look at Daryl Talks Games video on the subject matter. But regardless of whether or not you've personally experienced the kinds of trauma represented in Omori, you are likely to still be able to empathize with its characters. As we saw in the last section, it was exceedingly easy for me to put myself in Sunny and Basil's shoes, and I suspect most players slipped into that frame of thought without second-guessing it. The whole indie game with themes of depression memes bother me because it takes the game's meticulous attention to emotional resonance, its well-drawn, figuratively and literally, characters, and interweaving expressions of hard-to-talk-about feelings, and boils it down to just depression. Do you think people like Omori because it's about depression? No, they adore the game because it's about so much more. Omori gets its hooks in you where it matters most, your emotions. Omori doesn't hook you because it's about depression or just some sad shit, but because the gamut of emotions expressed throughout its entire narrative is leagues ahead of what players typically expect from video games. Even if a game with ludicrously expressed emotions and complex psychological topics doesn't resonate with you, it's precisely those qualities that underpin the entirety of the Omori fandom. In my estimation, All other qualities, expansive as they may be, rise out of the game's natural emotional resonance. Even though the qualities of Omori generate its impressively energetic fandom, the fandom has a mind and will of its own. The picture of the game the community presents in fanfiction and memes is an altered, perhaps even distorted, view of the game. How could it not be? Omori is a singular piece of software that communicates a complicated narrative through text dialogues and ludic features. The Omori fandom is a hodgepodge of different fan creations spread across the internet in a wide variety of places, each piece a reflection of what someone took away from the game, often twisting and adjusting the game's presentation to make someone laugh, make a point, or better express why Omori resonated with them. Still, for me, someone who played through most of Omori before engaging with the fandom, I can't help but feel that my understanding of what the game is continues to shift. Not because my opinions on the game change over time from introspection, but because I continue to encounter fan creations that emphasize certain aspects of the game at the expense of others. Every day that passes, the greater the distance between me and my original Omori playthrough. Yet I continue to engage with the Omori fandom, continue to write this script, continue to see memes on Reddit or on my Twitter feed. Slowly but surely, the Omori fandom's vision of Omori takes over, and my own initial interpretations grow weaker. The fandom keeps the game alive beyond the 20 or so hours it takes to complete the game, but in doing so, must change it. Because it was not meant, and I mean this in the most loose sense, to live beyond those 20 hours, and thus it must be adapted and readapted over and over in order to stay relevant. Yet, while this sounds almost a bit dire, I consider this video, this personal act of interpretation, to be my contribution to the fandom, a way of crystallizing how I feel about Omori before it gets lost to the burgeoning sense of community that swirls around this game. But just how making or consuming an Omori meme subtly changes your disposition toward and understanding of the game, so too does the act of writing. I didn't make the connection between Wizard of Oz and Omori before I started outlining that section. I didn't deeply consider how games play with emotions before I set out to make this video and was trying to think about unique aspects of the game. I didn't fully realize why the ending of Omori is so powerful despite the fact that it didn't resonate with me until I started writing about it. Simply put, the act of interpretation itself, whether on an individual level, like me writing this script, or on the communal level, like the entire Omori community making memes around Kel, changes the meaning of the game. There is a saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And when it comes to fan culture, we could say no piece of media survives fan contact without interpretation. Okay, well, that sounded better in my head. But the point still stands. Once we start interpreting a piece of media, we change it. Once others start reading those interpretations, that media changes on a social level. What's so interesting to me is the juxtaposition between the act of interpretation and the raw emotion of Omori. Omori is in some respects a game that invites individual interpretation, and in others, one which purposefully obfuscates the possibility. While I can objectively look at the multiple endings of the game, the surreal imagery that leads nowhere specific, the psychological traumas, or the way the game purposefully gives no answers to some of its most sacred questions, and come to the conclusion, of course the game wants me to interpret it, right? Wants me to read it. And yet, all those same markers lead to the opposite conclusion. The game interprets itself based on the player's actions. The beauty of games is they contain both of these possibilities. Perhaps interpreting Omori is foolish. Your actions in the game decide the meaning of the text for you. Playing Omori is interpreting Omori, but perhaps the point of Omori is to spend time figuring out what it all means to you. The tricky thing is, once you start engaging in a fan community, these lines become incredibly blurred. Interpretations become reality, perhaps best exemplified by the most interesting Omori meme. Every Kel meme is canon. Supposedly, this phrase came from Amokat, Omori's creator, but I can't find a record of it. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm skeptical of this origin story. Regardless of whether or not it's factually true that the creator of the game spoke this creed, what matters is the community picked it up and ran with it. The 5 words, "Every Kel meme is canon," are so socially powerful within the Omori community that fans use them to make their own interpretation of the game legitimate or rewrite the narrative of the game in its entirety. While the entire idea may seem unintuitive or even stupid, "Every Kel meme is canon" makes sense as an offspring of a game whose creative identity is banked on the imagination of a teenager. At this juncture, it may be useful to define what we mean by canon and what we mean by Kel meme. Canon in fan communities refers to what fans agree is officially part of the story. In some ways, we can imagine canon as being a proxy for how the news reports the truth. Canon is fixed and agreed upon, the foundation of the community. From it, the wellspring of fan content flows. Without some semblance of canon holding a fandom together, would a fandom even exist? Of course, what is or is not canon is always a complicated affair. For instance, we can agree that Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz is from Kansas, but can we agree on whether or not the land of Oz is or is not real? The arguments that spawn from media are genuine topics of discussion, but the search for truth or canon remains a core part of all fandoms. If we go a little more abstract, we can find these kinds of discussions across history. For instance, we could say that the oldest arguments about canon are those relating to holy scriptures, where entire religious schisms occur because different fandoms disagree on how to read them. Note, again, I am a religious person. I'm not criticizing these schisms or religion in general, but I'm interested in how these kinds of discussions about media or about texts are innately human, and tracing them back in time helps show that. While canon may be what fans accept as the truth, as divined from the texts themselves, that does not stop fans from creating their own alternate canons. I like Sarah Zed's quick definition from her video on fanon, which is any aspect of a work that is mutually agreed upon and engaged with by the fan base on a wide scale that is actually not canon to the original material. She pointedly contrasts fanon with headcanon, a phrase suspiciously close to headspace, which refers to the more personal act of individual interpretation. Fanon is where headcanon becomes social, considering that, for the most part, a canon is also a socially agreed upon set of constructions. The power of fanon comes from the collective agreeing something is more desirably true for their fandom than whatever the text defines as truth. What's interesting about fanon, besides the many conflicts that arise out of it, is just how far a community can go with their newfound power. They may wholesale invent or delete characters from the narrative, rewrite entire scenes or plot points, or rewind the clock to undo twists and turns they don't appreciate. What's interesting about the Omori fandom, though, is that every Kel meme is canon is just about the most logical extreme form of fanon possible. While you may think every Kel meme is canon might limit the fact of possibilities for fanon to become canon, you'd be sorely mistaken. In the Omori fandom, for at least some people, it is enough to simply stick Kel's face anywhere on any image and declare that since every Kel meme is canon, the corresponding image is now a canon to Omori. Whether that may be Kel serving in Vietnam, saving Sunny or just like running a YouTube channel, Kel, an embodiment of boundless enthusiasm and chaos in the world of Omori, and even more so in the fandom, makes sense as the locus point for this fourth wall breaking, reality bending turn of phrase. But what are the consequences of turning anything you can imagine regarding Kel into the literal events of the game Omori? If we take the concept at face value, Kel turns the idea of canon on its head. Don't think of it as multiverses where Kel changes the events of Omori or of the real world and each one of them is as valid as the last, because that's not what canon means. Canon means one true fiction. Thus, if every Kel meme is canon, that means that all possible events that could happen around Kel do happen around them, all at the same time and in the same universe. Kel is boundless, immortal, infinite. Whatever anyone imagines of Kel becomes the truth, at least as far as the fanon is concerned, and thus everything within Omori loses all meaning or gains all meaning. My favorite Kel meme, where he saves Mari from her death, touches on just how far fandom can stretch the bounds of a piece of media. After all, isn't it just sweet how the fans of the game want these characters to avoid all the suffering we know is ahead of them because of this one event? Wouldn't it be so much more convenient if it could just not happen? Yet, the sweet musings of such memes betray the core of Omori's story. Actions have consequences, and it's how we deal with those consequences that make us human, that force us to change, cause us to grow. So, what gives? Should we just abandon the memes? Or perhaps the fandom entirely? I'm not so sure. Perhaps it is useful to turn to a more contemporary scholar of fandom, Francisca Coppa, and her wonderfully titled essay, Fuck Yeah, Fandom is Beautiful. Coppa seeks to discern the differences between first wave and later fan scholars and argues the importance of maintaining the difference between follower, i.e., someone who uses a media as directed, and fan, a self-identified class of people who form communities, creating and expanding universes with their fan labor. What strikes me as valuable is the turn she makes near the end. She pushes back against the industrial ownership of fandom, writing,
"It is important to remember that fandom is made of people, and that fandom is beautiful, because fandom's in danger of being owned. Our work, our communications, our relationships to and with each other. Fandom is more than its economic or revenue potential. If all of fandom starts to look like Comic-Con, i.e. an industry convention disguised as a fan convention, we run the risk of reducing all fans to followers."
To me, every Kel meme is canon pushes completely against the commoditization of fandom. Instead of subtly giving the keys of what should be a homegrown community to the people who make the media in question, particularly large media conglomerates like Disney, Omori's fandom feverishly pulls in the opposite direction, allowing the fandom to dictate what the game is or isn't, because the game is static, it's fixed, it's not changing or going anywhere. Omori is Omori. The only way it can evolve and stay relevant to its fans is for the fandom to take the reins, which is exactly what every Kel meme is canon does. Hands the car keys to you and me, allows us to transform the game. It keeps the message of Omori in the hands of people who play the game, rather than adhering to a single story we can all agree upon, which is particularly important in a game as multifaceted, both inside the narrative and in its interpretive possibilities as Omori. Every Kel meme is canon allows me to make this video, explore the meanings of Earthbound and outsider art, of headspaces and faraway towns, of emotional battle charts and twist endings, all with the safe knowledge that I don't have to reach the truth with a capital T, because if I just stick a Kel meme in here, it's the truth, as long as you resonate with it, as long as it adds meaning to your understanding of the game, makes you think, makes you want to chat, makes you want to create with the same feverish energy I've spent countless hours making this video. So, tell me the truth. Do you resonate with what I've had to say?